The hospital room was a study in stark efficiency. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the air, accompanied by the steady hum of machinery that seemed more alive than the man tethered to it. The walls, painted a muted shade of beige, offered no comfort. The sharp scent of disinfectant clung to everything, a constant reminder of the fragility of life in a place that both prolonged and extinguished it. Benjamin Carter lay motionless on the hospital bed, his once robust frame reduced to frailty. His pale, weathered skin contrasted sharply with the crisp white sheets. He stared blankly at the ceiling, his expression hard and unyielding, as if daring the universe to strike again. Benjamin was no stranger to power. A titan in the world of finance, his name once commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Now, diagnosed with terminal cancer and abandoned by his family, he was a shadow of the man he had been. His sharp tongue had driven away his children, his ex-wife, and even most of the hospital staff. But not Emily Dawson. Emily entered the room with practiced efficiency, pushing a cart loaded with medical supplies. Her steps were soft but deliberate, her presence calm yet firm. A petite woman with auburn hair tied neatly into a bun, she radiated quiet determination. Despite her composed exterior, a storm brewed inside her. Her fiancé, Thomas, had texted her again that morning, demanding to know when she would leave her nursing job. He was always clear. Her career was a waste of time compared to the social aspirations he had planned for their future. "You're better than this," he always said. But Emily knew the subtext. Better than the patients, better than this life she had chosen. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," Emily said as she approached his bedside. Benjamin didn't respond, his cold blue eyes flicking to her briefly before returning to the ceiling. She checked the monitors, adjusting his drip with the care of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "You need to eat something today," she said gently. "Why? So I can stay alive for another week and endure more pity?" His voice was raspy, but still carried the edge of a man accustomed to cutting others down. Emily took a deep breath, choosing to ignore the sting of his words. "It's not about pity," she replied evenly. "It's about giving yourself a chance." "A chance for what? Redemption? Don't waste your speeches on me. I'm past saving," Benjamin snapped. Emily paused, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared his medication. She wasn't sure why, but his cynicism hurt more than it should. Perhaps because, in some ways, she understood what it felt like to feel trapped. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was another message from Thomas. "We need to talk tonight. I'm not waiting forever." The words felt like a leash tightening around her neck. "Trouble in paradise?" Benjamin asked, his sharp eyes catching her flinch. Emily froze, then forced a smile. "Just work stuff." Benjamin smirked faintly but said nothing more. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of burdens neither wanted to discuss openly. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the quiet hum of the machines in Benjamin's room was suddenly interrupted by an alarm. Emily, who had been charting notes at the nurse's station, felt her stomach drop as Benjamin's room number flashed on the monitor. She bolted into the room, where Benjamin lay unresponsive, his face pale and clammy. The heart monitor showed a dangerously irregular rhythm. "Benjamin," she called, shaking his shoulder gently. When he didn't respond, she sprang into action. Grabbing the crash cart, she quickly administered a dose of epinephrine and began chest compressions. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Despite the cold professionalism drilled into her over years of nursing, fear gripped her heart. The seconds stretched into eternity as she worked to revive him. Finally, the heart monitor steadied, its rhythmic beeping resuming as Benjamin gasped for air. Emily slumped back, relief washing over her like a wave. She placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "You're okay," she said softly, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring him or herself. Benjamin's eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, the walls around him seemed to crumble. "Why did you bother?" he rasped, his voice weak but laced with genuine curiosity. Emily hesitated, searching for an answer that would make sense to both of them. "Because you're not past saving," she said finally, her voice firm. Benjamin stared at her, something unspoken passing between them. It wasn't gratitude, Not yet. But it was a crack in the fortress he had built around himself. Emily left the room a few minutes later, her heart still racing. She couldn't shake the image of Benjamin's face in those moments when he had hovered on the edge of death. For the first time, she felt an unfamiliar pull toward him, an ache she couldn't explain. As she stepped into the hallway, her phone buzzed again. Another message from Thomas. "Don't forget who you belong to." Emily clenched her jaw, her mind swirling with thoughts she wasn't ready to confront. Back in his room, Benjamin stared at the ceiling, the faint trace of a smile on his lips. For the first time in years, he wasn't entirely alone. Benjamin Carter's days in the hospital had begun to take on a peculiar rhythm. The constant presence of Emily Dawson, quiet, steadfast, and remarkably unshaken by his barbed remarks, was an anomaly he couldn't quite ignore. On one particularly quiet morning, Benjamin watched her as she adjusted the blinds in his room, letting in slivers of pale sunlight. "You're unusually cheerful for someone dealing with people like me all day," he said, breaking the silence. Emily glanced over her shoulder, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Cheerful might be a stretch. Resilient, maybe." Benjamin huffed, a ghost of a laugh escaping him. "Resilient enough to endure me, I suppose. But why? Most people would have given up by now." Emily paused, her gaze meeting his. "Because everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, even if they've forgotten how to show it themselves." Her words lingered in the air, sharper than any retort he might have mustered. For a moment, Benjamin felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Respect, perhaps. Later that day, Emily's phone buzzed as she walked toward the staff lounge for her break. It was a text from her sister, Sarah. "You're coming over for dinner tonight, right? We need to talk." Emily sighed. She knew what talk meant. Sarah had never liked Thomas and made no secret of her disdain for his controlling ways. At dinner that evening, Sarah wasted no time. "Emily, you're not yourself anymore. I see it every time you talk about Thomas." "I'm fine, Sarah," Emily replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "No, you're not. He's smothering you, and you're letting him. You deserve someone who supports your dreams, not someone who sees them as a burden." Emily looked down at her plate, her appetite gone. "It's not that simple. He's reliable. Safe." "Safe isn't the same as happy," Sarah said firmly, reaching across the table to take Emily's hand. "You've spent so much time taking care of others. When are you going to take care of yourself?" Back at the hospital the next day, Emily moved quietly through her routine, Sarah's words echoing in her mind. Benjamin, as if sensing her distraction, said, "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders." Emily hesitated before answering, surprised at how easily the words came out. "Just family stuff." "Family," Benjamin mused, his expression darkening. "They're good at disappointing you when it matters most." Emily glanced at him, surprised at the hint of vulnerability in his voice. "Maybe," she said softly, "but sometimes they're the ones who remind you who you really are." Benjamin didn't respond, but something in his gaze softened. For the first time, it felt as if they were truly speaking to each other, not as nurse and patient, but as two people weighed down by the choices they'd made. The hospital had its own rhythm, an ecosystem of whispered conversations, hurried footsteps, and the ever-present hum of machinery. Among the staff, there was an unspoken awareness of the more curious dynamics at play. Dr. Vanessa Mills, the hospital's no-nonsense director, had started noticing Emily's unusual dedication to Benjamin Carter's care. Vanessa stood outside Benjamin's room, arms crossed, watching through the glass as Emily carefully adjusted his pillows. Her brows furrowed as she turned to a colleague. "Dawson's spending a lot of time in there. She's professional, but I hope she knows where the line is." Inside the room, Benjamin's eyes followed Emily as she bustled about, her movements precise but noticeably softer than with other patients. "You're here more than most," Benjamin remarked, breaking the silence. "Do I warrant such special attention? Or do you just have a soft spot for lost causes?" Emily stilled, his words cutting closer to the truth than she liked. "I'm doing my job," she replied evenly, though her voice betrayed a flicker of hesitation. Benjamin mused, his gaze lingering on her. "If you say so." Later that evening, Emily returned home to find Thomas waiting for her, his posture tense. "You're late," he said, his tone clipped. "It was a long shift," Emily replied, brushing past him. Thomas followed her into the kitchen. "It's more than that, isn't it? You've been distant, distracted." "Don't think I haven't noticed," Emily sighed, pulling a glass from the cupboard. "Thomas, I'm tired. I don't want to do this right now." "That's the problem," he said, stepping closer. "You never want to talk anymore." "I thought we were supposed to be a team, Emily. But it feels like your job, your patience, always come first." Emily tightened her grip on the glass, guilt twisting in her stomach. She knew he wasn't entirely wrong, but the growing pull she felt toward Benjamin was something she couldn't explain, even to herself. The next day, Benjamin surprised her with a rare display of openness. "I had a daughter once," he said suddenly, his voice softer than she'd ever heard. Emily looked up, startled. "Had? She stopped speaking to me years ago," Benjamin continued, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "I suppose I earned it. Money doesn't replace being present." His words hung heavy in the air, revealing a crack in his impenetrable facade. Emily felt her heart ache for him, a mix of compassion and something she dared not name. The day began like any other, but the tension in Benjamin Carter's room was palpable. He sat silently in his chair by the window, his face pale and drawn. The light filtering through the blinds illuminated his features, sharpening the hollows in his cheeks. Emily could sense something was different the moment she stepped inside. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice soft. He didn't respond. Instead, he stared at a slip of paper in his hand. "A printed report from the oncologist." "Benjamin?" Emily prompted, using his first name for the first time in weeks. Finally, he spoke, his voice flat and devoid of its usual edge. "It's worse. The cancer's spread. It's just a matter of time now." Emily's chest tightened. She approached cautiously, her heart aching at the sight of him so defeated. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and hollow. "Don't be. It's not your fault. If anything, it's mine for thinking I could outrun this." Benjamin's hands trembled as he crumpled the paper into a ball and tossed it onto the floor. For the first time since she had met him, he looked utterly broken. Unable to maintain the professional distance she'd carefully cultivated, Emily knelt beside him. "You're not alone," she said softly, placing a gentle hand on his. He flinched at first but didn't pull away. Instead, he turned to her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Aren't I? My family wants nothing to do with me. All I have left is this, and even that's slipping away." The rawness in his voice shattered something inside Emily. "You have me," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Benjamin looked at her, searching her face for traces of pity or obligation, but all he found was sincerity. For a moment, the air between them was charged with an unspoken connection. That night, back in her apartment, Emily sat at the kitchen table, staring at the engagement ring on her finger. Thomas had called twice, but she hadn't answered. She thought of Benjamin, his vulnerability, his courage in the face of despair, and wondered if she had been fooling herself all along about what she wanted in life. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what her life might look like if she chose her own path instead of the one laid out for her. Across town, Benjamin sat alone in the dim light of his room, her words echoing in his mind. "You have me?" Emily entered Benjamin's room late that morning, her usual brisk demeanor noticeably subdued. Her hair, typically tied neatly back, was slightly disheveled, and her hands fidgeted with the edge of her scrub top. Benjamin watched her carefully as she moved to adjust the foreline. He noticed it almost immediately, the faint bruising on her wrist, partially hidden beneath her sleeve. "What happened?" His voice was sharper than usual, cutting through the silence like a knife. Emily froze, her fingers still on the foreline. "It's nothing," she said quickly, avoiding his gaze. Benjamin leaned forward, ignoring the ache in his chest. "That's not nothing," he said firmly. "Did someone do that to you?" Emily shook her head, forcing a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "I just bumped into something. I'm clumsy, that's all." But Benjamin wasn't convinced. He'd seen enough in his life to recognize a lie when he heard one. "Emily," he said softly, his tone shifting to something gentler. "You don't have to tell me, but don't insult my intelligence by pretending everything's fine." Her shoulders tensed, and for a moment, he thought she might walk out. But instead, she sat down in the chair by his bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It's Thomas," she admitted finally, her voice barely audible. "We argued last night." He grabbed my arm. Benjamin's jaw tightened. "That's not an argument. That's control. And it's not okay." Emily sighed, her gaze fixed on the floor. "It's complicated. He says he's just worried about me. About us. He doesn't like that I spend so much time here, that I'm so invested in my job." Benjamin studied her for a moment, the wheels in his mind turning. "Do you even want to marry him?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Emily looked up, startled by the bluntness of it. "I don't know," she admitted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I thought I did. I thought it made sense. But now," her voice trailed off as she struggled to articulate the growing doubt she felt. Benjamin's gaze softened. "Life's too short to live for someone else's expectations. Trust me on that. I've wasted enough time trying to be who people wanted me to be." Emily looked at him, his words echoing in her mind. A flicker of defiance sparked in her chest, though she wasn't sure if she was ready to act on it yet. As she left his room, Benjamin watched her go, silently hoping his words had planted the seed she needed to find her own path. The hospital was eerily quiet as the storm raged outside. Lightning illuminated the hallways intermittently, followed by low rumbles of thunder that seemed to reverberate through the walls. The rain tapped against the windows in Benjamin Carter's room, a relentless rhythm that mirrored the unease in Emily's chest. She had been checking on Benjamin less frequently since their last conversation. The growing awareness of her feelings for him was something she wasn't ready to confront. Tonight, however, the storm and her unsettled mind had drawn her to his room once again. Benjamin was awake, his gaze fixed on the window as lightning streaked across the sky. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with exhaustion. Emily hesitated in the doorway before stepping inside. "The storm's louder than usual," she replied, her tone light as she moved to check his vitals. "You don't have to pretend," Benjamin said, his sharp eyes catching hers. "I know you don't come here just to fuss over my machines." Emily paused, her hands lingering on the edge of the monitor. "I guess I don't," she admitted softly. She pulled a chair closer to his bed and sat down, her posture uncertain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The storm outside seemed to cocoon them, isolating them from the rest of the world. "I envy you," Benjamin said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. Emily blinked, caught off guard. "You envy me?" He nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "You have this courage. You do things because you believe in them, not because they're expected. I spent my whole life chasing expectations, my father's, my colleagues', my family's. And look where it got me." Emily swallowed hard, his words striking a chord. "It doesn't feel like courage," she said quietly. "Most of the time, I feel like I'm failing everyone. My fiancé, my family, my patients. Even you." Benjamin's brows furrowed. "Me? You're the only person who's treated me like I'm worth something, Emily. If anything, you're too hard on yourself." His words stirred something in her, a mix of relief and guilt she didn't know how to process. She leaned back in her chair, her hands gripping the armrests. "I don't know how to stop feeling like I have to be everything for everyone," she confessed. "That's because no one's told you it's okay to put yourself first," Benjamin said softly. Another crash of thunder rolled through the room, but the sound was secondary to the stillness between them. Emily's eyes searched his face, noting the lines etched by pain and regret. "Sometimes I wish I could start over," she murmured. "So do I," Benjamin replied, his voice laced with a vulnerability he rarely showed. In the dim light, Emily reached out hesitantly, her hand brushing against his. The touch was fleeting, but it lingered in the space between them, heavy with meaning. Benjamin didn't pull away. "Emily," he said, his voice low, "you don't have to save me, but don't lose yourself trying to save someone else." Her breath hitched, the unspoken implication hanging in the air. The storm outside seemed to amplify the tension, each clap of thunder a reminder of the storm within her. Abruptly, Emily stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "I should go," she said quickly, avoiding his gaze. Benjamin's eyes darkened with something she couldn't quite name. Disappointment, perhaps, or understanding. "Emily," he began, but she was already halfway to the door. "I'll check on you in the morning," she said, her voice trembling as she disappeared into the hallway. Benjamin stared at the empty doorway, the warmth of her touch still lingering on his hand. For the first time in years, he felt something other than anger or regret. But the weight of her retreat left him wondering if he'd ever have the chance to feel it again. Emily leaned against the wall outside his room, her heart pounding in her chest. The guilt was suffocating, but beneath it, a flicker of something dangerous, something she wasn't ready to name, burned brighter with each passing moment. The storm continued to rage outside, a reflection of the chaos both of them felt but couldn't yet face. The tension at the hospital was palpable the next day. Emily could feel it with every glance from her colleagues, every pause in conversation when she entered a room. DRA. Vanessa Mills had been more watchful than usual, her sharp gaze lingering just a bit too long whenever Emily was near Benjamin's room. Emily's unease only deepened when DRA. Mills called her into her office that afternoon. The office was as stern as its occupant, shelves lined with medical texts, a framed diploma, and a single potted plant struggling to survive in the dim light. "Emily," DRA. Mills began, gesturing for her to sit. "I've noticed you've been spending a significant amount of time with Mr. Carter." Emily's stomach tightened. "He's one of my assigned patients," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "Yes, but you seem to be taking a more personal interest in his care," DRA. Mills said, her voice carefully measured. "I understand that he's a challenging case. Terminal patients often require more attention, emotionally and physically. But I need to remind you that boundaries are important. For your sake and his." Emily's pulse quickened. She opened her mouth to protest, but DRA. Mills raised a hand. "I'm not accusing you of anything improper," she said, her tone softening slightly. "But I've been in this field long enough to know the dangers of becoming too attached. It can cloud your judgment and make things harder when the inevitable happens." The word stung, even though Emily knew DRA. Mills was right. "I'll keep that in mind," she said quietly, standing to leave. That evening, Emily returned home to find Thomas waiting for her. He was seated on the couch, his posture rigid, his jaw set in a familiar line of irritation. "We need to talk," he said, his voice clipped. Emily sighed, setting her bag down. "About what?" "About your job." "About us," Thomas said, standing and crossing the room to face her. "I've been patient, Emily, but it's obvious this isn't working anymore. You're putting that hospital, those patients, ahead of everything else." "Ahead of me?" "That's not true," Emily said, though even as she spoke, she felt the weight of the lie. Thomas scoffed. "Don't insult me. I can see it, Emily. You're changing, and not for the better. That Carter guy? He's in your head, isn't he?" Emily's silence was all the confirmation Thomas needed. "I'm done waiting," he continued, his voice growing colder. "If you don't quit that job and focus on us, there's no future here." His ultimatum hung in the air like a storm cloud. Back at the hospital, Benjamin was wrestling with his own turmoil. Emily's absence from his room that day had left him more restless than usual. He hated the weakness it revealed in him, this growing need for her presence. When she finally entered his room later that night, the tension between them was palpable. "You're late," Benjamin said, his tone lighter than his expression. "Long day," Emily replied, her voice subdued. Benjamin studied her, noticing the faint redness around her eyes, the tightness in her posture. "What happened?" he asked, his voice softening. Emily hesitated, then sat down in the chair beside his bed. "Thomas," she admitted finally. "He doesn't understand why I stay here, why this job matters to me. He wants me to leave." Benjamin's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because of me?" Emily looked away, her silence answering for her. Benjamin sighed, running a hand over his face. I'm not worth this, Emily. Your job, your relationship, don't let me ruin your life. You're not ruining anything, Emily said firmly, her eyes meeting his. Thomas doesn't understand me. I'm not sure he ever did. But you, she stopped herself, shaking her head. I don't know what this is, Benjamin, but it feels real. And that terrifies me. Benjamin's expression softened, the weight of her words settling between them. I don't want to be the reason you lose yourself, he said quietly. You're not, Emily replied, her voice trembling. If anything, you're helping me find myself. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy but not uncomfortable, a shared understanding passing between them. When Emily finally left his room, Benjamin stared at the door long after it had closed, grappling with the truth he hadn't wanted to face. He cared for her more deeply than he'd thought possible, and that care came with its own set of fears and responsibilities. The next morning, Emily found herself sitting at her sister Sarah's kitchen table, cradling a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Sarah leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her younger sister with a mix of concern and determination. I didn't want to bring this up, but you need to know, Sarah began, her tone measured. Emily glanced up, her brow furrowing. Know what? Sarah hesitated, then pulled out a file she had tucked under the counter. Thomas is in trouble, Emily. Big trouble. Emily's stomach sank as Sarah placed the file on the table. Tentatively, she opened it, her eyes scanning the documents. Financial reports, discrepancies, emails flagged with warnings. He's been hiding things, Sarah continued. Misappropriated funds, fraudulent filings. If this gets out, he could lose everything, and so could you if you're tied to him when it does. Emily's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. How did you get this? I have a friend in finance, Sarah admitted. I asked her to look into Thomas because I've had a bad feeling about him for a while. I needed to protect you. Emily's head spun. She wanted to dismiss it, to tell Sarah she was wrong, but the evidence was right in front of her. Why would he do this? He's always so careful, so calculated, because people like Thomas think they're untouchable, Sarah said softly, placing a hand on her sister's shoulder. But you don't have to be dragged down with him, Emily. You need to leave before it's too late. That evening, Emily sat in Benjamin's room, the weight of the file pressing on her mind. She had brought it with her, almost unconsciously, and now it sat in her lap as she stared out the window. Benjamin watched her in silence for a while before finally speaking. You're not here tonight, he said gently. Emily startled, glancing at him. Sorry, I found out something today. About Thomas. Benjamin gestured toward the file. Does it have to do with that? She nodded, hesitating before handing it to him. Sarah found it. Thomas has been hiding financial misconduct. It's worse than I could have imagined. Benjamin scanned the contents, his expression darkening. You need to confront him, he said firmly. Emily bit her lip. I'm scared. If this is true, it changes everything. Benjamin leaned forward, his voice soft but resolute. Emily, you deserve better than this. Confront him. Protect yourself. Later that night, Emily did exactly that. She waited until Thomas came home, file in hand, her heart pounding as she stood in the living room. We need to talk, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Thomas frowned, tossing his keys on the counter. What's this about? Emily thrust the file toward him. Explain this. His face paled as he opened the file, his eyes scanning the documents. Where did you get this? He demanded, his voice rising. That doesn't matter. Emily shot back. What matters is that you've been lying to me. Hiding things. Thomas slammed the file down on the coffee table, stepping closer to her. You had no right to dig into my business, Emily. I had every right, she countered, her voice shaking with anger. You've been lying to me, to everyone. What else aren't you telling me? Thomas's face darkened, and before she could step back, he grabbed her arm, his grip painfully tight. You don't understand the pressure I'm under, he hissed. I've done everything for us, for our future, and now you're turning on me? Emily wrenched her arm free, tears stinging her eyes. You did this for yourself, Thomas. Don't try to make it about us. For a moment, she thought he might strike her, but instead, He took a step back, his expression shifting to something almost desperate. "Emily," he said, his tone softening, "I've made mistakes, but I need you. I need us. You can't leave me now. Not when everything's falling apart." She hesitated, the guilt and fear twisting in her chest. "I've always been there for you," Thomas continued, his voice dripping with practiced sincerity. "You owe me this, Emily. You owe us a chance." Emily returned to the hospital the next morning, her emotions a tangled mess. The bruise on her wrist from Thomas's grip was darker now, and she subconsciously pulled her sleeve down to cover it. When she entered Benjamin's room, he immediately noticed the shadow in her eyes. "You confronted him," he stated. She nodded, sitting heavily in the chair beside his bed. He turned it back on me. Said I owe him, that I can't leave now." Benjamin's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to her wrist, where the faint bruise peeked out. "Did he hurt you?" Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "It's not that simple." "It never is," Benjamin said softly. "But you don't owe him your loyalty, Emily. Not when he's betrayed yours." His words struck something deep within her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what her life might look like if she walked away. The following evening, the air in Benjamin's hospital room was heavy with silence. Emily sat at her usual spot beside his bed, her gaze fixed on the rain streaking the window pane. Benjamin studied her carefully, noting the tension in her posture, the way she avoided meeting his eyes. "What's on your mind?" he asked finally, breaking the stillness. Emily hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "It's everything," she admitted. "Thomas, my job, my life. I feel like everything is unraveling all at once." Benjamin's voice softened. "You're stronger than you think, Emily. You've faced things most people wouldn't dare to." She gave him a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "And you? What about the things you've faced?" Benjamin leaned back against his pillows, exhaling slowly. "I've made my share of mistakes," he said. "More than I care to admit." Emily turned to him, sensing the shift in his tone. "What do you mean?" For a long moment, Benjamin didn't answer. He looked away, his gaze distant. "There's something you should know," he said finally. "Something I should have told you sooner." Emily's stomach tightened. "What is it?" Benjamin ran a hand over his face, the weight of the confession evident in his expression. "Years ago, one of my companies was involved in a deal to acquire a chain of properties. It was a lucrative opportunity, on paper at least, but one of those properties was a hospital." Emily's breath caught. "It wasn't personal," Benjamin continued quickly, his voice thick with regret. "I didn't know the specifics at the time. All I saw were the numbers. The hospital was underfunded, barely breaking even. Closing it was efficient." "What hospital?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Benjamin hesitated, the name catching in his throat. "Ridgewood Community Hospital." Emily froze. The name hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Ridgewood had been her first job, a place where she had learned not just to care for patients, but to find meaning in her work. When it closed, it had devastated the staff, patients, and the surrounding community. "You're saying you're the reason Ridgewood shut down?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I didn't know," Benjamin said, his tone pleading. "I swear, Emily." By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. It wasn't my decision directly, but it was my company. My responsibility. Emily stood abruptly, stepping away from the bed as if the distance could dull the pain. "Do you know what that hospital meant to people? What it meant to me?" Benjamin's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I know, Emily, and if I could take it back, I would. But I can't. All I can do now is tell you the truth." The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in around Emily. She needed air, space, anything to escape the weight of his words. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Benjamin staring after her with a mixture of regret and sorrow. As she stepped into the hallway, the memories came flooding back. Ridgewood had been a lifeline for her during a difficult time in her life. The loss of the hospital had been a wound that never fully healed, a reminder of how the powerful could crush the vulnerable without a second thought. Now, to learn that Benjamin, the man she had begun to trust, to care for, had played a part in that loss was almost too much to bear. The following day, Emily avoided Benjamin's room. She buried herself in other tasks, tending to patients and avoiding questions from her colleagues. Dra. Mills gave her a knowing glance but said nothing, while Sarah's repeated texts went unanswered. By evening, however, she knew she couldn't avoid him forever. With a deep breath, she stepped into his room, her posture stiff and her expression guarded. Benjamin looked up from his bed, relief flickering across his face. "Emily," he said softly. "I can't just forgive this," she said, cutting him off before he could speak further. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled at her sides. "Do you have any idea what that hospital meant to people? To me? I do now," Benjamin said, his voice low, "and I hate myself for it. But if you think I don't care—" "Care?" Emily interrupted, her tone sharp. "If you cared, you would have asked questions. You would have thought about the consequences before signing off on something that destroyed lives." Benjamin flinched, her words hitting their mark. "I know," he admitted. "I was blind, too focused on the numbers, the profit. I was everything I hate about who I used to be. But I'm not that man anymore, Emily. I swear." She stared at him, her heart torn between the pain of his confession and the sincerity in his eyes. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said finally, her voice cracking. Benjamin's shoulders sagged, but he nodded. "I understand," he said quietly, "but I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that I'm more than the mistakes I've made." Emily didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room, her emotions a storm she couldn't yet contain. That night, as she sat alone in her apartment, Emily replayed the conversation in her mind. She thought about Ridgewood, about the lives that had been upended, about the patients who had nowhere else to go. But she also thought about Benjamin, the man he was now, not the man he had been then. For all his flaws, he had shown her a vulnerability and honesty she hadn't expected. And though she wasn't ready to forgive him, she couldn't deny that she still cared for him. The question was, could she ever truly move past this? The hospital was quiet as Emily made her way to Benjamin's room. It was late, past visiting hours, but something inside her wouldn't let her stay away. She had spent the entire day replaying their last conversation, the rawness of his confession, and the weight of her own emotions. She hesitated at his door, the faint glow of the bedside lamp spilling into the hallway. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. Benjamin was awake, sitting propped against the pillows, his expression distant. His face softened the moment he saw her, though it was tinged with apprehension. "Emily," he said quietly, his voice low and rough. She crossed the room slowly, pulling a chair closer to his bedside. "I couldn't leave things the way they were," she admitted, her gaze flickering between his face and the floor. Benjamin nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I don't blame you for being angry," he began. "I'm angry at myself too. For everything I've done. For everything I didn't do." Emily swallowed hard, her throat tightening at the vulnerability in his voice. "I've spent most of my life running," he continued. "From my failures, from the people I hurt, from any chance of real connection. I thought money would be enough, that success would shield me from regret. But it didn't. And now, here I am, at the end of it all, realizing how empty that life was." He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands, which fidgeted with the edge of the blanket. "When I met you, I didn't expect this. I didn't expect to care. But you made me see things differently. You made me want to be better, even if it's too late." Emily's heart ached at his words. "It's not too late," she said softly. Benjamin looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. "I'm trying to make amends," he said, "but I know I can't undo the damage I've caused. All I can do is try to leave something better behind." Her voice was trembling when she replied, "You've already done more than you realize. You've shown me that it's okay to let people in, that it's okay to want more." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy with unspoken emotions, a delicate balance of pain and understanding. "I'm not perfect, Emily," Benjamin said finally. "Far from it. But if you're willing to give me a chance, I'll spend whatever time I have left proving to you that I'm worth it." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, and she reached out, her hand brushing against his. "You don't have to prove anything to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I already see you for who you are now, and that's enough." The hours seemed to blur after that. Emily stayed by Benjamin's side, the two of them talking in hushed tones, sharing pieces of themselves they had kept hidden for so long. At one point, the storm outside picked up, the sound of rain tapping against the window creating a rhythmic backdrop. Emily leaned back in her chair, her fingers still loosely intertwined with Benjamin's. "You know," Benjamin said, his voice tinged with a rare hint of humor, "I never thought I'd be grateful for a hospital stay." Emily chuckled softly, shaking her head. "It's not exactly the most romantic setting." "No," he agreed, a faint smile playing on his lips. "But I don't think it matters where we are. It matters who we're with." His words sent a warmth through Emily that she hadn't felt in a long time. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the powerful man he once was or the patient fighting a losing battle, but the person he had become, vulnerable, honest, and profoundly human. Without thinking, she leaned forward, her free hand brushing a stray strand of hair from his forehead. The gesture was simple but intimate, and it made Benjamin's breath catch. "Emily," he said softly, his voice trembling. She shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't push me away. Not now." Benjamin's hand tightened around hers, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. As the night deepened, Emily rested her head on the edge of the bed, her eyes growing heavy but her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Benjamin ran his fingers through her hair absently, a gesture so tender it took him by surprise. "I don't deserve this," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Emily tilted her head to look at him, her expression soft but firm. "No one deserves love, Benjamin. We just find it, and I've found it in you." He closed his eyes, her words settling over him like a balm. "I don't want to waste what little time I have left," he said. "Then don't," Emily replied, sitting up to meet his gaze. "We'll take it one day at a time." Together. Benjamin reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. It was a simple touch, but it carried all the emotions they couldn't yet put into words. And in that moment, despite everything, the pain, the uncertainty, the fear, they both knew they had found something worth fighting for. By the time dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside quiet and still. Emily remained at Benjamin's side, her hand still in his, both of them feeling a fragile but unshakable sense of peace. For the first time in years, Benjamin Carter didn't feel alone. The hospital was abuzz with whispers. Emily felt the weight of every sideways glance, every sudden pause in conversation as she passed through the halls. Something was wrong, but no one would meet her eyes long enough to tell her what. When she reached the nurse's station, her friend Claire hesitated before speaking. "Emily, you need to see this." Claire handed her a phone, its screen displaying a local blog post. Emily's heart sank as she read the headline, "Scandal at St. George's. Nurse accused of inappropriate relationship with terminal patient." The accompanying text was brutal, detailing allegations of an improper relationship between Emily and Benjamin. The article included anonymous quotes accusing her of neglecting other patients and using her position for personal gain. Emily's knees felt weak. Who would do this? Claire's expression was pained. "I don't know, but the timing, it's suspicious." Emily's mind raced, the pieces falling into place. Thomas. It had to be Thomas. This was his retaliation for her defiance, his way of punishing her for not bending to his will. Later that day, Emily was called into Dr. Mill's office. The normally composed director looked more strained than usual, her fingers steepled on the desk. "Emily, I need you to understand how serious this is," Dr. Mills began, her voice calm but firm. "These allegations have put the hospital in a difficult position. Until we can conduct a full investigation, I have no choice but to place you on temporary suspension." Emily's throat tightened. "Vanessa, you know me. You know I would never." Dr. Mills raised a hand to stop her. I do know you, Emily, and that's why this is so hard. But this is about the hospital's reputation. You understand that, don't you? Emily nodded stiffly, tears stinging her eyes. I understand. Benjamin noticed something was off the moment Emily entered his room that evening. She moved slowly, her normally steady hands trembling as she adjusted his fore. What happened? He asked, his voice soft but insistent. She hesitated, then sat down heavily in the chair beside his bed. It's Thomas, she said finally, her voice cracking. He leaked rumors about us, about me. Now I'm suspended while they investigate. Benjamin's expression darkened, his hands clenching the blanket. That man is poison, he said, his tone sharp. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what to do. This could ruin everything I've worked for. Benjamin reached out, taking her hand in his. You won't go through this alone. I'll clear your name. She looked at him, startled. You can't. You're in no condition. I can. He interrupted, his voice resolute. And I will. I won't let him destroy you because of me. The next morning, Benjamin summoned his lawyer, Richard, a polished man with a no-nonsense demeanor. I need you to handle something for me, Benjamin said, his voice firm despite the fatigue that gripped him. I want you to gather every piece of evidence we can find against Thomas Green. Emails, financial records, anything that discredits him. And I want it fast. Richard frowned. Benjamin, you're not in the best shape to be dealing with this. I don't care, Benjamin snapped. This isn't just about me. It's about Emily. She doesn't deserve this. Richard nodded, sensing the urgency in his client's voice. I'll get started immediately. While Richard worked behind the scenes, Emily faced the fallout at the hospital. Her colleagues, once friendly and supportive, now kept their distance. Patients whispered as she walked by, their trust eroded by the rumors. She spent her suspension at home, alternating between despair and anger. Sarah visited often, offering comfort and reminding her that she didn't have to face this alone. Benjamin's right, Sarah said one evening as they sat in Emily's small living room. You've spent your whole life putting everyone else first. It's time you fought for yourself. A week later, Benjamin received a call from Richard. I have everything we need, Richard said. Thomas has been embezzling funds from his firm and hiding it through a series of shell companies. If we release this, it'll destroy his credibility and any accusations he's made against Emily. Benjamin smiled faintly, a rare glimmer of satisfaction breaking through his exhaustion. Good. Do it. The next morning, Thomas's scandal was splashed across every news outlet. The headlines shifted from Emily to Thomas, exposing his financial crimes and tarnishing his reputation beyond repair. At the hospital, DRA. Mills called Emily back into her office. I owe you an apology, DRA. Mills said, her voice heavy with regret. The accusations against you were baseless, and the board has cleared you of any wrongdoing. You're reinstated, effective immediately. Emily exhaled, the weight on her shoulders lifting slightly. Thank you. When Emily returned to Benjamin's room that evening, she found him looking weaker than usual, but his smile was genuine. I told you, he said softly as she sat beside him. I wasn't going to let him win. Tears filled her eyes as she reached for his hand. You didn't have to do this for me. I did, he replied, his voice faltering. Because you're worth it. For the first time in days, Emily allowed herself to believe that things might be okay. As the sun set, casting a warm glow across the room, Emily leaned forward, resting her head on Benjamin's shoulder. The fight wasn't over, but for the moment, they had won. And that was enough. Benjamin Carter's room felt quieter than usual. The hum of the monitors and the occasional murmur of footsteps in the hallway were the only sounds breaking the stillness. Emily sat by his bedside, her fingers absent-mindedly brushing over the edge of the blanket. She had been reinstated at the hospital, but the lingering impact of the rumors and her confrontation with Thomas weighed heavily on her. Benjamin's health had worsened over the past few days, his pallor more pronounced, his movements slower. Yet his resolve remained sharp. We need to do more, he said suddenly, his voice weaker but laced with determination. Emily turned to him, her brow furrowed. More? Benjamin, you've done enough. You cleared my name. That's all I needed. It's not enough, he insisted, his hand gripping hers with surprising strength. Thomas isn't just hurting you, Emily. He's hurting people. The truth needs to be out there. Your health can't take this, she protested, her voice trembling. Benjamin's lips quirked into a faint smile. Emily, I don't have much time left. If I can use what's left of my influence to do something good, then it's worth it. That afternoon, Benjamin instructed his lawyer, Richard, to release the final batch of documents exposing Thomas's misconduct to a national investigative journalist. The move was calculated but risky. It would ensure maximum exposure but also draw attention to Benjamin's own involvement in some ethically questionable decisions from his past. As the story broke, the backlash was immediate. News outlets pounced on the scandal, painting Thomas as a corrupt figure who had manipulated others for personal gain. But Benjamin's name also appeared in the coverage, linking him to other controversial deals. Emily watched the fallout unfold, torn between gratitude and worry. The world now saw Benjamin not just as a powerful businessman, but as a flawed human being. She knew how much he valued the small shred of dignity he had left, and seeing it erode hurt her more than she expected. That evening, Benjamin sat in his bed, visibly drained. His breathing was labored, his chest rising and falling unevenly. "You've done enough," Emily said softly as she adjusted his pillow. He reached for her hand, his grip weaker than before. "It was worth it," he whispered. But as he spoke, his body convulsed suddenly, his face contorting in pain. Emily's heart leapt into her throat as the monitors around him erupted in a series of frantic beeps. "Benjamin!" she cried, her hands moving to stabilize him. A nurse rushed into the room, followed closely by DRA Mills, who immediately assessed the situation. "He's crashing," Mills said grimly. Emily stood frozen, tears streaming down her face as they worked to stabilize him. After what felt like an eternity, Benjamin's vitals leveled out, though he remained unconscious. "He's not out of the woods," Mills said, turning to Emily. "He needs rest, and you need to give him space." "I'm not leaving him," Emily replied, her voice firm despite the tears. "Emily, you're too close to this. You've already risked enough," Mills said, her tone softening. "I don't care," Emily shot back. "He fought for me when no one else would. I'm not abandoning him now." Mills hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Stay, but don't interfere. He's going to need everything he has to pull through this." As the hours dragged on, Emily remained by Benjamin's side, her hands clutching his limp one. The room was dim, the only light coming from the soft glow of the monitors. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You've come so far, Benjamin. Don't give up now." She thought of all the moments they had shared, the quiet conversations, the unspoken connections, the way he had taught her to fight for herself even as he faced his own battles. Losing him now felt unbearable. In the early hours of the morning, Benjamin stirred. His eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused before settling on her. "You're still here," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Of course I am," Emily said, tears streaming down her face. His lips twitched into the faintest smile. "Stubborn, as always." Emily let out a choked laugh, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "I learned from the best." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of everything unspoken passing between them. Despite his frailty, Benjamin's eyes still held a spark of the man he had become. Resilient, regretful, but at peace. "You're going to be okay," Emily said, her voice trembling. Benjamin's hand squeezed hers weakly. "So are you," he replied. "You're stronger than you think." As the sun rose, casting a soft glow across the room, Emily felt a fragile sense of hope. Benjamin had made it through the night, and while his battle wasn't over, neither was hers. They had both sacrificed so much, but in the quiet moments they shared, Emily knew one thing for certain. They had fought for something real, and that was worth everything. The decision wasn't easy, but in Emily's heart, it felt right. Standing in DRA Mill's office, she handed over her resignation letter, her hands steady despite the weight of the moment. "I don't want to do this," DRA Mills said, her tone firm but her expression tinged with sadness. You're one of the best nurses we've ever had, Emily. I need to be with him, Emily replied softly. Benjamin doesn't have much time left, and I owe it to him, and to myself, to see this through, Mills sighed, leaning back in her chair. You're sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything, Emily said, her voice resolute. Mills nodded, a faint smile breaking through her otherwise professional demeanor. Then I wish you the best. That evening, Emily returned to Benjamin's room. He was sitting up in bed, looking out the window at the setting sun. The golden light bathed his face, softening the lines of exhaustion and pain etched into his features. You look serious, he remarked as she entered, a hint of his old wit glimmering in his tone. I made a decision today, Emily said, pulling a chair close to his bedside. Benjamin turned to her, his brow furrowing. What kind of decision? I resigned, she said simply. His eyes widened in surprise. You what? I quit my job, Emily repeated, her voice steady. I want to be here with you, Benjamin, for however long you have left. Benjamin shook his head, a mix of disbelief and concern crossing his face. Emily, you can't just throw your career away for me. I'm not worth it. You don't get to decide that, she said, a hint of a smile softening her words. This isn't just about you, Benjamin. It's about me too. I've spent my whole life doing what everyone else expected of me. For once, I want to do what feels right. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for any trace of doubt. When he found none, his shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of her words sinking in. You're stubborn, he muttered, though there was no malice in his tone. You've mentioned that before, she said with a small laugh. Benjamin's gaze softened, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Why, Emily, why would you give up so much for someone like me? She reached out, taking his hand in hers. Because you matter to me, Benjamin. Not your money, not your past, you. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what if. For the first time in years, Benjamin felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with illness or regret. It was the unfamiliar but undeniable feeling of being cared for, not for what he had or what he could offer, but for who he was. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments that neither of them took for granted. Emily read to him from his favorite books, they shared stories from their lives, and sometimes they sat in companionable silence, simply enjoying each other's presence. Benjamin's health continued to decline, but he no longer seemed afraid. The bitterness that had once consumed him was replaced by a calm acceptance. One afternoon, as Emily adjusted his pillows, Benjamin reached out and touched her wrist. Emily, he said, his voice hoarse but steady. She paused, sitting beside him. What is it? I don't think I've ever thanked you properly, he said, his eyes meeting hers. For everything. For seeing me when no one else would. For staying, even when it wasn't easy. Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she managed to smile. You don't need to thank me, Benjamin. You've given me more than you realize. He smiled faintly, his hand lingering on hers. I thought I'd end this life alone, with nothing but regrets. But you changed that. You've given me something I never thought I'd have again. What's that? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Peace, he said simply. That night, as Emily sat by his bedside, Benjamin drifted off to sleep with her hand in his. The steady rhythm of his breathing filled the room, and for the first time in weeks, Emily felt a sense of calm. She knew the end was near, but she also knew that they had made the most of the time they had left. In the quiet of that moment, surrounded by the soft glow of the room, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had found something rare and precious in Benjamin, a connection that defied time, circumstance, and expectations, and for that, she would always be grateful. The morning light streamed gently through the hospital window, casting a warm glow across Benjamin's room. Emily sat by his bedside, her hand wrapped around his. The soft rise and fall of his chest was slower now, his breathing labored but steady. She had spent the entire night with him, unwilling to leave his side even for a moment. The hum of the machines was the only sound in the room, a faint backdrop to the peace they had created together. Benjamin's eyes fluttered open, his gaze finding Emily immediately. His lips curved into a faint smile, though his strength was fading quickly. "You're still here," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I am," Emily replied, squeezing his hand gently. Benjamin's eyes softened, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence filled with unspoken emotions. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling, "for leaving you, for not having more time." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she shook her head, her voice steady. "You don't have to apologize, Benjamin. You've given me so much more than time. You've shown me how to live." A tear slipped down Benjamin's cheek, and Emily reached out to gently wipe it away. As the hours passed, Benjamin's breathing became shallower. The sunlight outside dimmed, replaced by the soft glow of the evening sky. Emily held his hand tightly, her heart breaking with each fragile breath he took. "I wish I could stay longer," Benjamin whispered, his words slow and deliberate. "You've stayed long enough," Emily said softly, "and you've given me everything I could ever need." He managed a small nod, his eyes closing briefly before opening again. "There's something for you." "In the drawer," he said, his voice faltering. Emily reached into the bedside drawer, finding an envelope with her name written in his handwriting. She held it close, her chest tightening. "Don't open it yet," he said, a hint of his old humor returning. "Give me my moment." Emily let out a soft laugh, tears streaming down her face. "I'll wait," she promised. When Benjamin's final breath came, it was peaceful. His hand grew still in hers, his face relaxed as if he had simply drifted into a deep sleep. Emily sat in silence, her tears falling freely but without bitterness. She rested her head on his arm, her heart aching with loss but filled with gratitude for the love they had shared. Later that evening, back in her small apartment, Emily sat at her kitchen table with the envelope Benjamin had left for her. Her hands trembled as she opened it, pulling out a single folded sheet of paper. The letter was written in his familiar, deliberate handwriting. "My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, then my time has come. I don't want you to mourn me, not in the way people usually do. Instead, I want you to remember the moments we shared, the laughter, the quiet nights, the way you made me feel truly alive for the first time in years. You taught me what it means to live with purpose, to connect with someone in a way I never thought possible. For that, I will always be grateful. Emily, promise me something. Live for yourself. Don't let anyone or anything dictate who you should be. You are strong, compassionate, and capable of so much more than you realize. Chase the life you've always wanted, no matter how uncertain it may seem. And when you think of me, know that I'm proud of you. You gave me peace, and now I hope to give you the same. All my love, Benjamin." Emily pressed the letter to her chest, her tears flowing freely. The ache of losing him was sharp, but his words filled her with a quiet strength. In the days that followed, Emily began to rebuild her life. She visited Sarah often, finding solace in her sister's unwavering support. She started making plans to open a small clinic in a rural area, a dream she had always pushed aside. Though the pain of Benjamin's absence lingered, she carried his memory with her, not as a shadow, but as a source of light. His letter became a reminder of her own resilience, a testament to the transformative power of love and connection. One evening, as Emily watched the sunset from her balcony, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The colors of the sky mirrored the emotions within her: sorrow and hope, loss and renewal, all blending together to create something beautiful. For the first time in a long while, Emily smiled, knowing that she was exactly where she needed to be. The small town of Willow Creek sat nestled between rolling hills, its quiet charm a world away from the bustling city Emily had left behind. The single main street was lined with quaint shops and modest houses, their weathered facades speaking to a community built on resilience and simplicity. At the edge of town, in a building that had once been an old general store, Emily stood in the doorway of her new clinic. The sign above the door read Willow Creek Health Center, the fresh paint glinting in the sunlight. Inside, the clinic was modest but warm. Secondhand furniture had been lovingly restored, and the shelves were lined with medical supplies donated by friends and former colleagues. A small waiting area featured comfortable chairs and a bookshelf filled with children's books. It wasn't much, but it was hers. a dream made real by the encouragement of someone who had believed in her. Emily moved through the space, checking supplies and organizing charts. Each small task carried a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The first patient arrived shortly after noon, a young boy with a scraped knee, accompanied by his worried mother. Emily knelt to examine the injury, her calm voice soothing both child and parent. As she worked, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Over the weeks that followed, the clinic became a beacon for the community. Farmers, shopkeepers, and families came through its doors, grateful for affordable care in a place where resources were scarce. Emily poured herself into the work, her days filled with moments that reminded her why she had chosen this path. Yet, even in the busiest hours, Benjamin's memory was never far from her thoughts. One evening, after a particularly long day, Emily sat at her desk, reviewing patient notes by the light of a small lamp. On the corner of the desk sat Benjamin's letter, carefully framed and placed where she could always see it. She reached for it now, her fingers brushing the glass as she reread his words. His voice echoed in her mind. "Chase the life you've always wanted, no matter how uncertain it may seem." Her lips curved into a soft smile. "You'd like it here," she murmured, her voice carrying the weight of both sorrow and gratitude. As the weeks turned into months, Emily found herself growing more connected to the town and its people. She attended local events, shared meals with neighbors, and began to feel something she hadn't in a long time, a sense of belonging. The work wasn't always easy. There were late nights, difficult cases, and moments of doubt. But through it all, she carried Benjamin's memory as a source of strength. His encouragement, his belief in her, had set her on this path, and she was determined to honor it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily stepped outside the clinic, leaning against the wooden railing of the porch. The sky was a masterpiece of colors, fiery oranges fading into soft purples and blues. She closed her eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over her, and thought about how far she had come. The journey hadn't been what she had planned, but it had brought her to a place where she could finally be herself. Her thoughts drifted to Benjamin, to the way he had changed her life in such a short time. His love had been unexpected, fleeting, but it had left an indelible mark on her soul. As she opened her eyes and gazed at the sunset, she whispered, "Thank you, Benjamin, for everything." The world felt quiet and still, as if the universe itself had paused to listen. Emily stood there for a long time, watching the sky transform. She felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that while her life would always carry traces of loss, it was also filled with hope and purpose. Love, she realized, wasn't just about the time you shared with someone. It was about how that love changed you, how it stayed with you and shaped the person you became. And in that moment, as the stars began to peek through the fading light, Emily knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.